I'm Frank Joyce, by the way, and I'm from Detroit, and I've lived there my whole life. I've lived in some other places on work projects and so on, but I have continuously had a residence in Detroit. And both my grandparents were in the automobile industry, as was my father. And so I did grow up, as we say in Detroit, with motor oil in my veins. And that industry had quite a golden age that lasted from roughly, well, certainly by the end of World War II through about 1980. Detroit had, by that time, become the car capital of the world, and that the car economy powered an enormous amount of prosperity in Detroit for many, many people. One of the reasons that it was, excuse me, one of the reasons it was able to do that is that coming out of World War II, the United Auto Workers Union, which had fought the battles to become recognized before World War II, but emerged from World War II very strong, as a very strong union. And as a result of its strength as the auto industry prospered, so did the auto workers prosper. But at that same time, looking back now, the seeds of the problems of Detroit were also being sown, because after World War II, it was the policy of the local government, the state government, the federal government, the banks, and others to make Detroit a racially segregated community, so that black people basically were confined to live within the city limits of Detroit. And the growth of the auto industry was driven in part by the growth of suburbs. And so you had to have a car to get back and forth to work. To this day, there is virtually no significant mass transit in Detroit. We are prisoners of cars.
What kind of car did you have at this time?
That's a great question. My very first car, when I was not even old enough to drive, a friend of my father's had an old Model A, a Ford Model A from the 30s. And so I bought that car. It didn't run. I completely disassembled the engine and put it back together again and made it run. But I still wasn't old enough to drive. So I had to sell the car at that time. But then when I became old enough to drive, and I became independent of my family at quite a young age, so this will surprise you, the very first car I bought was a French car, a Simca. They don't even make Simcas anymore. And I had that for a few years, and then later I had an MGTD. I was quite the sporting dude at that point in my life. And since then, I've owned Fords, and I've owned Chevrolets, and I've owned, since then, mostly I have owned General Motors or Ford or Chrysler products.
For which company did you work, and did your father work?
My father worked for a for most of his life. He had his own economic problems, but he mostly worked for automotive supplier companies, one of which made wheel covers, another one of which supplied paper products to the auto industry, and so on. I went to work in the 1970s something, I don't quite remember the year now, at a Chrysler assembly plant. That plant, I drove a high-low in that plant. I still say to this day it was maybe the best job I ever had in my life. That plant closed. Chrysler, by even the 1970s, was beginning to be a very troubled company, and was the first of what we still call in Detroit the Big Three. Well, now we call them the Detroit Three. They're not so big anymore. But Chrysler was already running into troubles, and so that plant closed, and I then got transferred to the Dodge truck plant, which is out in Warren, Michigan. It's a suburban plant. And I worked there for a few years and got laid off from there. That would have been probably 1980 or 81, at a time when there was an early crisis in the auto industry, a more traditional recession. But in retrospect, it was a sign of things to come, of the troubles the auto industry would have. It was the golden age of the Detroit auto industry because of, well, a couple things come to mind. One is that even though the industry was cyclical in the traditional way of capitalist business cycles, the UAW was powerful enough to negotiate wages so that you would receive your full wage or close to your full wage, even if you were laid off, even if the industry had a downturn, sales went down, and so until they recovered, you would still have a good income. And that, of course, provided tremendous stability in the economy for the whole area. And when times were good and when sales were up, you not only got a good wage, but you got a lot of overtime. And of course, the union rules were that you got paid time and a half up to a certain point, and then double time beyond that point, and then triple time even beyond that point. So a single wage earner could make a living that was enough to support a family, to buy a home, and to have and a car and some of the nicer things in life. And this language, I think, now is abused, but in the United States now people talk about the middle class. And what they mean by that mostly is the benchmark for that is to be an auto worker, was kind of the essence of being middle class. You had a good wage, you had some control over your own hours, you had paid vacations, you had holidays, you had a good life. Well, I've been a member, I think, of the UAW in 5 different locals, 2 different factories, and so on. When I got laid off that last time, I had been in the media and had been a journalist before that. So at that point, I went back into the media and I went to work for a radio station and came to be the news director of that radio station, a rock and roll radio station. We had a great time back in those days. And from there, I continued, I worked for a television station, went back and worked for the public radio station in Detroit, and then in the mid-1980s, I went to work for the United Auto Workers in their communications department, and later became the director of that department, and spent 18 years working for the United, as a member of the United Auto Workers staff. I'm now still a member of the United Auto Workers because the UAW has local 1981, which is actually a union local of freelance writers. And I do a lot of freelance writing these days, so I'm now a member of, still a member of that UAW local. The bankruptcy of Detroit, which has, of course, one of the things that has put Detroit in the news all over the world in recent years, was a slow motion movie. It didn't all happen at once. And I have talked about and written about this, the golden age of the auto industry is also, in a way, I think, the golden, I don't call it the golden age. I call it maybe silver, maybe bronze, maybe not even a metal, maybe plastic, but age of capitalism itself. Because I think there was a social contract in effect in the United States, and maybe auto workers were kind of at the top of that process, that was a carryover from the reforms that took place during the Depression. It was a carryover from the United States having essentially won World War II and having been an economic powerhouse after World War II when other economies were still in recovery. And so from the end of the war until about 1980 was this high point, both for the auto industry, but I think for the whole United States. Starting in 1980, I think things began to deteriorate, certainly in the auto industry. But I also think it's a common misperception to think that the problems that led Detroit to bankruptcy are completely a result of what happened in the auto industry, because I think that's not what happened. I mentioned this earlier, that there was a poison pill, if you will, in the prosperity that came with the auto industry. And the poison pill goes all the way back to the beginning of the United States and the fact of slavery and the treatment of dark-skinned people, of African Americans, but also to the settler colonialism that expanded the United States first from, of course, the East Coast and a small region of British colonies all the way to California. Before the United States was a country, it was expanding westward and building a military machine to do that. Now, that may seem like a big distraction from your question, but I think it's not a distraction from the question, and I think it's important, especially in the US, but for anybody paying attention to the United States, to understand that even in the New Deal, even in the social contract of the Franklin Roosevelt administration, was built in racial segregation and racial separation and racial discrimination. The way that gets us to the Detroit bankruptcy is that as the economy started to decline in 1980 and continuing in some ways to this day, not everybody was affected by that decline in the same way. And in particular, white people had opportunities to adapt and adjust to a changing economy that were denied to black people. And black people were required basically by law, by custom, by financial practice, by culture, by many reasons, to live in essentially a ghetto.
No matter which education they had?
No matter which education they had. In Grosse Pointe Park, Michigan, where I live now, 3 blocks from the border of Detroit, we live in a working class section of that city, but it is part of a network of generally affluent suburbs. And until the late 1960s, it was not even possible for Jewish people or Greek people to live in those suburbs. The first African American who managed to buy a house in the Grosse Pointes probably didn't happen until maybe even the 1970s. These lines of segregation are still, they're not as rigid as they used to be. And in fact, my neighborhood now is very diverse, and we have African Americans and other minorities. But even still, we're a minority within all of the suburbs that surround Detroit. With a couple of exceptions, they are almost as white today as they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or 30 years ago. And there are many instances and episodes of African Americans. This started with African Americans not being allowed to live in certain parts of Detroit. And there is a place in Detroit, it's called the Burwood Wall. You can Google it and look it up. Burwood Wall, B-I-R-W-O-O-D. And it is a wall that was built within the city limits of Detroit, I believe in 1947, by a real estate developer to make the boundary between black people could live on this side of the wall and white people could live on the other side of the wall. And these real estate practices, of course, led to a lot of financial and real estate manipulation in turning neighborhoods that had once been white, making them available to black people, but in the process then selling new homes to white people who kept moving and moving and moving. First moving within the city and then moving outside of the city limits altogether. So this rigid policy of racial segregation is much more than is generally understood at the root of the Detroit bankruptcy. We still struggle enormously with racial issues. Again, let me go back a little bit because my own life started, my political life started in the civil rights movement in the 1960s. And I've written about this a little bit just recently. The very first political thing that I did was I was 19 years old and I was driving down a street called 8 Mile Road. 8 Mile Road is very famous, not just because of the movie starring Eminem, which is a very good movie, by the way, and which accurately captures quite a lot of this dynamic of racial discrimination and of racism. And at that time, there was a swimming pool, a public swimming pool, on the other side of the Detroit line, so to speak. And I saw a picket line there of mostly black people who were picketing the swimming pool. And I thought that was interesting, and I wondered what was going on. So I turned my Simca around and parked by the swimming pool and saw that they were protesting the fact that black children were not allowed to swim at that pool. And I said, well, that's wrong. And so I joined the picket line. And from that, I became involved in civil rights and racial issues ever since in Detroit and around the country and elsewhere. But it has given me an awareness and perspective of these issues that is unusual for white people, because white people live in a kind of bubble and they don't often think so much about their actions or the consequences of their actions or this racial divide other than to enforce it quite rigidly. So it's so ironic that even today, my wife and I, over the last year, have been involved in our own community. A block from our house, the authorities of our city built another kind of barrier that cut off a road between Detroit and our little suburb, Grosse Pointe Park. And all sorts of excuses were given for this, but it was clear that the motive of doing it was to make it harder for black people to go back and forth to between Detroit and this predominantly white suburb. Well, we've had a big fight with the city council and we've had a partial victory. The road has now been partly reopened and turned into a one-way street. This fight isn't over. And there are city elections coming up soon, and we're involved with that too. But I tell this story to make the point that these issues are just as fierce today as they have ever been, and they enter into the process of the bankruptcy also, because the thing that people don't understand about the bankruptcy is that the common explanation, and I've heard this here in Europe, and I hear it all across the everywhere I go, people say, Detroit went bankrupt because there was a crisis in the automobile industry. Not true. If that was true, why wouldn't all of the community, the structure of government in the United States is we have counties. Detroit is within Wayne County. It is not the whole county. It's the biggest city in the state and the biggest city in the county. Immediately to the north of Detroit is Oakland County and Macomb County. The populations of Oakland County and Macomb County are overwhelmingly white. The population of Detroit is overwhelmingly black. Not one city in Oakland County went bankrupt. Not one city in Macomb County went bankrupt. So if it was just these macro forces driven by big global changes in the automotive industry, then you would think that it would have had the macroeconomic forces don't recognize county boundaries. For that matter, Windsor, Canada is just across the river from Detroit. Windsor, Canada was subject to the same macroeconomic forces as was Detroit. Windsor, Canada didn't go bankrupt. None of these communities have, to speak of, had any serious fiscal problems whatsoever. Now, government in the United States at every level is way in debt and overfinanced and has its own problems, and we can talk about that or not talk about it. But here, I can't stress enough the importance of understanding the racial dynamic of this process.
When a white man comes and says, let's start the new way of living together, working together, whatever.
So the question is, why in this crisis that Detroit is in now, and those of us who are trying to build a different kind of economy and a new kind of economy there, why should black people trust somebody like me?
Yes.
They shouldn't. And what I mean by that is that I understand why they should be suspicious and why they should wonder, what are my motives really? In my own personal case, because I've done this work for a very long time, I have a kind of a reputation in Detroit now, and people know that I have been active in this. I'm not just showing up here. But one of the dynamics about Detroit now is that Detroit is attracting a lot of money from outside investors, not just outside of Detroit and not just from the suburbs, although that's true too, but there are a lot of Chinese investors, for example, who are buying up property in Detroit in tax foreclosures. Because there is, despite the bankruptcy being over and the city finances being kind of a little healthier and a little better lined up than they were before, none of the underlying problems of poverty or of racism have been addressed at all. So there are, I think, on the docket right now as we speak in Detroit, somewhere between 40,000 homes that are in either real estate foreclosure or tax foreclosure. And that could, some of them are abandoned properties, some of them are being lived in by squatters, some of them are being lived in by people who've lived there for years and years and years, but who for one reason or another fell behind in their tax payments or their mortgage payments, or they were victims of predatory loans. They refinanced their homes but didn't understand what the terms of the refinancing were, all of those problems. On top of that, there are 30-some thousand, I think, people who are vulnerable to getting their water turned off, because part of the bankruptcy was to restructure the water department, which serves not just Detroit, but the whole surrounding area of Detroit. And this has caused the new operators of the water department to try to ramp up collection efforts and try to collect, in some cases, overdue water bills of lots and lots of money that people now owe. And so they, instead of figuring out how to make water more affordable for poor people, they're spending millions of dollars to pay private contractors to go and turn people's water off. Now, how somebody who's already poor, and let's say if they have children or if they have elderly people in the home or whatever, are supposed to become more economically viable by turning their water off, no one has been able to explain. But again, this plays into a lot of racial stereotypes. So for example, on the one hand, there are also businesses and universities who are way behind in their water bills, who own hundreds of thousands of dollars in back water bills. They're not turning their water off. The punishment is being meted out mostly to the people who are least able to afford it. So that's strayed a little far from the question. What has come out of this, one of the positive things that has come out of this economic collapse, is that necessity, as the saying goes, is the mother of invention. And so people have tried to figure out how, if we're frozen out of participating in the mainstream economy, what kind of economy can we create to survive? And this is what's so exciting about Detroit today, because we had, I like to say, at least a 20-year period when the economic powers that be, the banks, the big real estate companies, the insurance companies, the car companies, et cetera, paid almost no attention whatsoever to Detroit. Well, you can get a lot done if nobody's bothering you. And you know, it's one thing to think about a model of political change, of protest and all that sort of thing. Well, if you protest, they are going to pay attention to you. But there has been a kind of, we leave them alone, they'll leave us alone. So, as we sit here today and talk, I would say a conservative estimate for the number of urban farms there are in Detroit is about 1,500. There's a lot of abandoned property. There's a lot of property that, so there's a lot of vacant land, and there are people who have started to grow produce and food and so on and become self-sufficient. It's being done in all sorts of different ways. Some of these urban farms are very small. They might be a vacant lot that's next door to your house. Some of them are as big as 5 acres. Some of them are organized as economic cooperatives, some as just, I don't even know what they are, and neither do the people who are running them. We're growing things and we're distributing them either to help people get food or we're selling them. However, part of what makes this so exciting is that as this urban agricultural movement has grown, it reaches new plateaus. And so people are able to cooperate more and they're able to develop markets for food. And this is happening not just in Detroit, but in other cities as well. In Cleveland, for example, in some ways they're doing this in a better way than some people, at least in Detroit, are, because they understand that what are called anchor institutions, that's universities and hospitals, that can't run away. You can't move a hospital even to the next county, let alone to Mexico or to China, just because you wouldn't have to pay the nurses so much, because the people who go to the hospital have to come from the local community. And schools and universities similarly, of course they can expand and they can go online, but they have to have some physical plant that's in the city. Well, they consume food. These are markets for food that can be grown 3 blocks away. And so more and more people are getting together and making arrangements with restaurants, with anchor institutions, et cetera, to stabilize and create a market. And how people are organizing that is very much in flux. It's very much what we talk about in Detroit. It's exciting to have these questions of kind of building an economy from scratch, if you will. We're not naive about that. We know we're not really building it from scratch, but it's different than what has come before. And I had mentioned earlier when we were talking, many places people are starting to try to build a degrowth movement. Well, we already had the degrowth part. So we are working on what kind of an economy do you have when you have basically been abandoned by capital. As it happens, Detroit is now attractive to all kinds of investors, old school, new school, old money, new money. And so we are having to deal with issues of gentrification, we're having to deal with issues of outside investors, and we're having to wrestle with all of these problems. But they're exciting problems to have, because we very much have the sense that we're just in a place and a time where we can help create the future. And it's not just about agriculture. More and more, as that has been, I hesitate to use the word pioneer because that kind of has a special meaning in the United States, but many of us have been pioneers, and so we're now starting to create alternative schools and alternative conflict resolution and alternative manufacturing. We have many, do people here understand the term Fab Lab? Does that mean something to people? There are many Fab Labs in Detroit now, and they conduct classes, and they are more and more helping people to come from the community, learn how to use 3D printers and other fabrication technology, figure out what they need. There's a company in Detroit now, they don't use fabrication technology actually, but they make buses for benches for bus stops. And some of them have a little library, lending libraries built in, where people leave books and take books and so on and so forth.
Let me interrupt you.
Sure.
When people start, do you remember like organizations which don't have any money? But they have a goal and they say, okay, we start. And how do they start? How do they motivate people to collaborate? How does this work?
Well, let me give one example that I know a little bit about. It's called Feed 'em Freedom, and it's operated by a couple, Wayne and Myrtle Curtis, and they have a house on a street in a very poor area of Detroit, which is most of Detroit, that they struggle to make the payments on the house and so on and so forth. But in a very small way, a few years ago, they planted a garden and they invited people to participate in the garden, including young people. And so they do readings and they teach classes and they help people understand healthy food and how to eat healthy. And slowly but surely, this little plot has gone from 1 lot to 2 lots. And I'm very excited about a project that we are doing with them right now where we are starting to plant grapes in Detroit, which once used to grow a lot of grapes, from which you can create another level of economic activity because you can, from grapes, you can make other products. You can make wine, you can make jam, you can make jelly. So you create a cash crop and then a market for the processing of that crop, and it takes it to a whole other level. So we're in the process of creating a growers co-op now, and we are next week when I get back, we're planting our first grapes. So this is a long, and we have another site that we're working with. We see these as demonstration projects at this point, just to show people what can be done. And we're working on the other side with a conventional investor who is a socially conscious investor and who wants to invest in Detroit, but who is prepared to put up money for the winemaking and marketing side of the operation. So the co-op will be a growers co-op, but it will have a market that's built in to grow crops that can be sold for cash. The investor, I think, has I think he has some conventional motives that this will be a profitable enterprise, but I think he is wealthy enough that he could invest someplace else, right? He doesn't have to do this, and he sees this as having a social benefit and as participating in something that is good for the people and so on. Now, we all know that in life and in economics, maybe this will turn out another way. And we know that the 2 biggest problems that I think we all know are right around the corner, we haven't had to deal with them too much yet, are questions of governance and conflict resolution. How do you resolve disputes amongst all these good people who are doing all these good things, but we're humans, and so we're going to have things we disagree about. How do we learn to deal with that in a different way than all of the models we've been given? And interestingly enough, this interview notwithstanding, we realize we're not really very good at communicating what we're doing. We have all these people with good communication skills, but it's amazing. People know about Detroit not so much because we communicate the story outward, but because the word has gotten around, and so people come to Detroit and they make movies and they write articles and they tell stories. Well, that's okay up to a point, and we appreciate some of that and don't appreciate some of it because we think people get it wrong. On that note, one of the things we have done about that is that last October we had our second conference called New Work, New Culture. Most of the people who came were young, and some people came from all over the world, from Europe, from Latin America, from the Middle East, etc. But it was a chance to talk about the theory of what we're doing as well as the specific practice of what we're doing. What are we growing? What are we manufacturing? What are we teaching? But why are we doing this? And what are these problems of governance and communication that we have to start to wrestle with? It was a very exciting conference, and it produced a little book called The New Work, New Culture Reader, which is out of print at the moment, but hopefully in a new, better, bigger version will be back in print. So we we're very clear about one thing. If anybody only takes one thing away from this conversation, it's that it's not enough to just do it. It's not enough to just grow some vegetables. It's very important to think about it and be intentional about it and think about, why are we doing this? Who are we involving? How are we creating a new way of interacting with each other that isn't dependent on what we call the JOB system or the old economy? So, and Detroit has a tradition of politics and a tradition particularly from James and Grace Boggs, who have been leaders and thinkers about this movement for a very long time, that doesn't let people get away with not thinking about it. And that's great. Well, we very much think about that, and we use the term, we say JOB, and we say the JOB system. And one of the things we haven't even settled yet is, should we say J-O-B, or it should be J.O.B. But the point of it is, it's so hard for people who have this system not in the world in which they live, but also in their heads, who think the only kind of economy that can exist is an economy where there's an employer and an employee, where there's a worker and a boss. And because that system kind of collapsed in Detroit, it created the space for even me, even somebody with a long trade union history, to say, you know, this isn't working. Let's quit pretending that it is. Let's quit pretending that we can recreate that system another time around. Although I understand there are people who think that. I argue with them all the time. What if we see this as an opportunity to reimagine work? In fact, it's interesting. When we had our first conference in 2011, we called it the Reimagining Work Conference. And then this last time around, we called it the New Work, New Culture Conference, which is kind of the evolution of our own thinking about how we're understanding both the problem and the solution. There are a lot of things wrong, and I think this is important, especially in coming to a relatively economically stable and affluent place like Austria or Germany or any place. The JOB system has a lot of problems. Even when it works, it doesn't work that well. It isn't necessarily that satisfying to people. And it recreates these hierarchical relationships between the boss and the worker, or the owner and the employee. And it's, even if it's a stable system for a nation or a region, it's almost never a stable system for a worker. All sorts of disruptive things of globalization, of new technology, can come along and knock you off your economic platform, so to speak. So what is a permanent condition of the JOB system? Unemployment. What is another permanent condition, especially now in these very disruptive times in which we find ourselves? Some people have 1 job, 2 jobs, 3 jobs. Some people have 0 jobs. Some people work 10 hours a day. Some people want to work 8 hours a day, but they can only find 2 hours a day of work. It's not all as great as it's been cracked up to be, even when it's operating at optimum efficiency. But it isn't, and it hasn't been, and in our view, in my view, it never will again. It's a period in the evolution of humans and how we organize work, how we organize life, how we organize our relationships with one another, that it's served a purpose. It's brought us to the point we're at, the good parts and the bad parts. But we think it's not, and this term is of course misused, we don't think it's sustainable, not just because it is so utterly and totally associated with growth, which will destroy the planet. You know what cancer is? Cancer is unrestrained growth. No one wants cancer. Well, as a species, we can't want the kind of growth we've had for the last 200 years anymore either. We'll not only make ourselves extinct, we're already making many animals and plant species extinct. And I don't have to tell people all the statistics and books and so on and so forth are out there that we are, and it's not just through climate change, it's through pollution, it's through destroying the oceans, it's through factory farming, it's through chemicals, it's through the potential for nuclear war, it's for the potential of pandemics, the likes of which we've never seen before. This system is headed off the cliff. And it's very exciting to be in a place in a time where we can start to think about, okay, what's a better way to do it? And people ask me all the time, you know, how did you come to this position or learn that or whatever? Mostly my answer is, I don't know, I guess I'm just lucky.